It started on a scorching summer afternoon, the kind of day where the heat seems to weigh heavy on your shoulders. The small courthouse in the sleepy southern town was usually quiet, its parking lot dotted with only a handful of cars. But today the air was thick with tension. A group of burly men on roaring motorcycles pulled up outside, their leather jackets emblazoned with a menacing emblem. At the head of the pack was a man named Buck, tall, broad-shouldered, and with a glare that could chill your bones. Buck wasn't just any biker. He was infamous in these parts for running his gang with an iron fist and a reputation that made people cross the street to avoid him. Buck stepped off his bike, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. He adjusted his sunglasses and spat on the ground, already irritated by the sight of the courthouse looming before him. He didn't care much for law or order, and he definitely didn't care for what he saw as the changing tides of this town. Buck had grown used to people fearing him, and today would be no different, or so he thought. Inside the courthouse, Judge Marcus Reed was preparing for the day's proceedings. Judge Reed wasn't someone you'd easily forget. His tall frame, calm demeanor, and piercing gaze gave him an air of quiet authority. But it was his story that made him unforgettable. Marcus had grown up in a nearby community where opportunities were scarce and racism was a shadow that followed his every step. But he had worked hard, fighting against the odds, to become the town's first black judge. It was a title he carried with immense pride, though he knew it came with its own set of challenges. Marcus had heard the whispers about Buck and his crew. He knew the kind of intimidation they thrived on, and he knew today wasn't going to be easy. Buck's gang had caused trouble more than once, and today Buck himself was being brought in for a slew of charges ranging from vandalism to assault. To Buck, the charges were nothing but an annoyance, something he planned to swat away with the same arrogance he brought everywhere. As Buck swaggered into the courtroom, flanked by a few of his loyal gang members, the room fell silent. The biker sneered as he scanned the space, his gaze landing on Marcus, who sat poised on the bench. For a moment, their eyes locked. Buck's sneer deepened, his arrogance almost palpable. He leaned over to one of his buddies and muttered something under his breath, loud enough to draw snickers from the men beside him. Marcus, unfazed, adjusted his glasses and called the courtroom to order. His voice was calm but firm, a tone that commanded respect. The proceedings began, and Buck made no attempt to hide his contempt. He rolled his eyes, smirked, and even yawned exaggeratedly at one point. To him, this was a game, a stage for his bravado. But as the evidence against him piled up, the cracks in his confidence began to show. Witnesses described Buck's actions in chilling detail, his threats, his violence, the fear he left in his wake. Still, Buck smirked, crossing his arms like none of it mattered. He was convinced this judge, like so many others, wouldn't dare stand up to him. But Marcus wasn't just any judge. He had seen men like Buck before, bullies who used fear as their weapon of choice, and Marcus knew exactly how to dismantle that facade. As the courtroom session progressed, Marcus' questions became sharper, his tone more commanding. Buck's smirk faltered, replaced by a twitch of discomfort. The tables were turning, and everyone in the room could feel it. By the time closing arguments began, Buck's confidence was hanging by a thread. He had underestimated the man sitting before him, just as he had underestimated the strength of the law when wielded by someone unafraid to use it. But Buck still had one card left to play: intimidation. As the court recessed for a short break, Buck approached Marcus. His towering figure loomed over the judge, his voice a low growl. "You don't scare me," he hissed, his breath reeking of defiance. Marcus looked up, unflinching. "And you don't intimidate me," he replied, his voice steady as steel. The room was electric with unspoken tension, the kind that made the air hard to breathe. Buck's gang watched from the back, their eyes flicking between their leader and the judge who refused to back down. What happened next would leave the entire courtroom and the town speechless. But for now, the air was thick with uncertainty, as everyone waited to see who would break first: the arrogant biker or the unshakable judge. The courtroom was unusually quiet as the recess dragged on. The air felt heavy, and the tension from Buck's confrontation with Judge Reed still lingered like a storm cloud about to burst. People whispered in hushed tones, exchanging glances, unsure of what would happen next. Buck's gang lounged in the back row, their smug confidence masking an undercurrent of unease. Even they could sense that something about this trial wasn't going the way Buck had expected. Marcus sat at the judge's bench, flipping through a file with calm precision. His expression remained unreadable, but inside, his mind was churning. Buck's bravado wasn't just an act, It was a weapon. Men like him thrived on control, on bending others to their will through intimidation. Marcus had faced people like this before, both in and out of the courtroom, but something about Buck felt different. There was a desperation in the man's eyes, hidden beneath the bluster. Marcus didn't know what it was yet, but he intended to find out. Meanwhile, across the room, Buck leaned against the wooden barrier separating him from the judge's bench. He had one hand shoved into the pocket of his leather jacket, the other gripping the edge of the barrier so hard his knuckles turned white. His earlier confidence had been shaken, but he refused to let it show. To Buck, admitting defeat was worse than losing. It was a weakness he couldn't afford. "Man, I don't get why you're so worked up," one of his gang members muttered, leaning close. "This guy's just another suit. They all cave sooner or later." Buck shot him a glare, silencing him instantly. "This one's different," he growled under his breath. His voice was low but tense, like a coiled spring ready to snap. The truth was, Buck couldn't shake the way Judge Reed had looked at him. Calm, steady, like he wasn't afraid of him at all. It wasn't just unsettling, it was infuriating. Buck was used to people flinching when he walked into a room, lowering their gaze, muttering excuses just to get away from him. But this man, this judge, had stood his ground, meeting Buck's hostility head-on without so much as blinking. As the minutes ticked by, the courtroom began to fill with murmurs again. People wondered aloud about what would happen when the trial resumed. Would Buck try another stunt? Would Judge Reed finally lose his cool? Some of the townsfolk in the gallery had shown up just to witness the spectacle, drawn by rumors of Buck's reputation and the growing tension between him and the judge. But while the courtroom buzzed with speculation, Marcus's thoughts drifted elsewhere. He thought about the long road that had brought him here, to this bench facing men like Buck. Growing up in the outskirts of this very town, Marcus had seen his share of injustice. He'd witnessed the way certain people seemed untouchable, their power protecting them from consequences. He felt the sting of prejudice himself, time and time again, as he fought to prove that he was more than the color of his skin. His father, a quiet man with callous hands and a firm sense of right and wrong, had taught Marcus the value of integrity. "You can't control what people think of you," his father would say, "but you can control how you respond. Always choose what's right, even when it's hard." Those words had stuck with Marcus, guiding him through years of schooling, countless late nights studying, and the uphill battle to earn his place in the judicial system. And now, sitting on the bench in front of Buck, Marcus knew this moment wasn't just about one man's trial. It was about something bigger, a test of whether justice could truly stand firm against fear. When the recess ended, the tension in the room rose once more. The clerk called the court back into session, and everyone settled into their seats. Buck sauntered back to his spot at the defendant's table, but the swagger in his step was noticeably less pronounced. He glanced toward the judge's bench, his jaw tightening when he saw Marcus' calm, unyielding expression. The prosecution resumed their case, laying out more evidence against Buck. Photos of vandalized property, medical reports from the victims of his assaults, and testimonies from witnesses painted a clear picture of Buck's reign of terror. Each piece of evidence was like a nail in the coffin, and the weight of it all seemed to press down on Buck, though he refused to show it. As the hours passed, Marcus observed every detail: Buck's clenched fists, his shifting posture, the way his gang members exchanged nervous glances. The cracks in their confidence were growing wider, and Marcus was determined to use that to his advantage. Then came the testimony of a young woman named Clara. She was in her early 20s, with a shy demeanor and a voice that trembled as she recounted her experience. Clara described how Buck had cornered her outside a local diner, threatening her after she refused to hand over her purse. Her voice wavered, but her words were steady, each one a small act of courage as she faced the man who had made her life a nightmare. For the first time, Buck's bravado slipped. His smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of unease as Clara spoke. He shifted in his seat, his gaze darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Marcus noticed it immediately. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied Buck's reaction. There it was, that desperation again. It wasn't just about the trial. Something deeper was eating at Buck, something he was trying to bury beneath his tough exterior. When Clara finished her testimony, the room was silent. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, and even Buck's gang seemed subdued. Marcus took a moment to let the silence settle before speaking. "Thank you, Miss Clara," he said, his voice steady but kind. "Your bravery in coming forward is commendable." Clara nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she stepped down from the witness stand. She avoided looking at Buck as she passed him, but the strength in her step was evident. Marcus turned his attention back to Buck. "Mr. Hayes," he said, addressing the biker by his full name for the first time, "you've heard the testimony against you. You've seen the evidence. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Buck hesitated, the muscles in his jaw working as he clenched his teeth. For a moment, it looked like he might lash out, his temper boiling over. But instead, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms defiantly. "I don't owe anyone an explanation," he said, his voice laced with venom. "This is all just a bunch of nonsense blown out of proportion. People like her," he jerked his chin toward Clara, "are too soft. They don't know how to handle the real world." The room erupted in murmurs, outrage rippling through the gallery. Marcus held up a hand, calling for order. When the room quieted, he fixed Buck with a steady gaze. "This court isn't about the real world, Mr. Hayes," Marcus said, his voice firm. "It's about accountability. And so far, all I've seen from you is a refusal to take responsibility for your actions." Buck opened his mouth to retort, but Marcus cut him off. "Save it," he said sharply, his tone brooking no argument. "We're not finished here. I'm not convinced you understand the gravity of your situation." The tension in the room was palpable, every eye fixed on Marcus and Buck. The air seemed to crackle with unspoken challenges, and the question hung in everyone's mind. How far was Buck willing to push, and how much further would Marcus push back?